was amazed at the fact that the women, well, they made everything they needed. They made their clothing. They had to use a wooden pestle to pound corn for flour. I have Johnny cakes are in here. That's what they ate mostly every single day. And I have a little sister in here who ends up doing some of the chores in the morning. You know, they had chickens, and so they had fresh eggs, and they had one cow, so they had milk. All of that had to be done very early in the morning, and the mother would make the griddle cakes, the Johnny cakes. And one of my friends, she made Johnny cakes for one of my book presentations, and believe me, I didn't really like them. But, you know, that's what they ate most of the time. And I also have a section about food and about different kinds of meals, because I wanted to know what they ate. And of course they grew. The women had a vegetable garden, and they also had an area where they would grow corn, squash, beans, all those kinds of things. And they did grow wheat and rye, but it sounded like it wasn't. These were all subsistence farms, not commercial farms. So mostly everything they needed, they either grew or they bartered for anything else they needed.
So how did the Indians feel when they came?
Well, see, I'm glad you asked that. That was one of the very important things that I interviewed a lot of different people who have knowledge of, maybe not 1650, but different times in local history. And from what I read and what I was told in the interviews, they got along very well in the beginning. In fact, the Native Americans taught them, we think that everybody planted in rows, and they didn't always do that. And the Native Americans showed them that they planted corn in the middle, squash around the corn. As it grew, it would grow around the corn, and the beans would grow up, the vines would grow up and around. It was very smart when you think about it. So they taught them how to do that. And that sustained them. That allowed them to have enough to eat. But, and the kitchen garden, the women would have kitchen gardens where they would grow different kinds of, like turnips and carrots and those onions. And they use onions and garlic as a, to give it some flavor. But they did get along in the beginning. That's what I really wanted to know, and I wanted to show that. It changed. It changed because of land and what was happening. And I mean, a lot of people know this, but the Native Americans looked at land very differently than European settlers. They really believed that you moved from place to place and that you didn't really own the land. And they were willing to share their land with the settlers, but the settlers wanted to buy it. So I don't think that was communicated too well on either side. And that's in the book. There's a land question, and they did buy in the town of Southold and near Fort Cutchogue. There is an area, they called it the Broad Plain, and they did keep increasing. The town of Southold did keep increasing the land that they bought from the Indians. And there's an area where, so they didn't have to clear it. That's why they bought the Broad Plain, which is smart. Yes?
Were you able to find much original source material that you could read through from the period?
Yes, but basically that was about land and who bought what. And
I
how,
see.
Yeah,
very long, dry trees.
Yeah, it wasn't, yes, it wasn't.
Nothing in the way of narratives of what was going on.
Not a lot of diary.
Yeah.
No, not narratives. I mean, there was some. And there's a lot on the Reverend John Youngs, who was the first person to help set up the town of Southold. There's a lot on that, how they lived and who, all the names, the original families, all those names keep popping up, you know, and how much land they had and so on. But not a lot of narratives. In fact, when I was writing the book, I'm a visual learner. We've talked about this. I have to see something to write about it. So there are no homes left. Actually, there are, but the old house in Cutchogue is, I don't know if you know that. It's a landmark home in New York State. It's the oldest, I think, English construction home in New York, in the Northeast. But every time I went to the museum, it wasn't open, so I couldn't see it. But when I went to the Historical Society, I did a lot of work there. They have these collections like they have in the libraries out here.
Well, at just about this time, over in England anyway, they were kind of becoming great diarists and
Yes.
writing a lot of things. And some people, you don't know how they made a living, they just seem to just
You write all the time.
write. But that's England, and this is the hinterland, and
I think,
it didn't translate probably for many years.
well, I also think that most of the people here, if you had a subsistence farm, you were working all the time.
Right.
In England, you might be the Lord Baron or so on, and other people would be doing all the physical work. But these families had their own farms. They had to do the subsistence, farming. They had to produce everything they needed. I don't know how much time they had to sit and write, but when I went to the people at the Southwold Historical Society, they have the Whitaker collection, and they have the museum. They told me there's a replica of the Barnabas Horton home that was one of the first homes in Southwold, and I wanted to see it because I wanted to write about this family. So they took me up into the barn in the museum, and it's even lit. It's about this big, but everything in there is to scale, and it's a replica of his. Barnabas Horton was a very famous, one of the first families, and very famous there. So they let me see the home, and that was great because I needed to see that. That's the model for the home that I wrote about. And then I did get to see the old house in Cutchogue, which is a bigger home, and it's very similar. But
Is that open on a more regular basis?
it's open on weekends, I believe. On weekends, yeah, I know. In the summer, our weekends are taken up with people coming out on a boat.
You can't tell them on the
So we don't go there on weekends. But I had to see that. I had to see what it looked like because I wanted to write about it. And so there are lots of details in the book about that home. And I didn't want to really use somebody's last name, and I chose that name at the end, but it's fictional. The family's fictional. So yes.
When you talk about people buying the land, they bought their own land, did the town or whatever it was, the common, did they buy land which was like common land where they could raise, animals?
As far as I know, when they first came from New Haven, they were given a grant for this land. And I'm not sure if it was from the King of England. I'm not sure because these were. Excuse me?
Earl of Sterling.
Okay.
What was that? The Earl of
Sterling.
I know they had.
Sterling.
Oh,
Yes. And Greenport, I thought was called. It was Sterling. Yes. So they did have a grant, but that religious community that came together, they were given parcels of that land that was part of the grant.
Proprietors, yeah.
So they had an area where they lived, and each of the people in I should say the men, helped clear each parcel so that people could build their home.
And there was also college.
Go ahead, please, jump in.
Interesting.
I'm the president and founder of the Historical Society in Flanders,
Okay.
which was originally part of Southampton Town, and it is now part of Southampton Town, so I might be able to help some of those details.
That's great. I have forgotten some of the stuff that I did. But I know that it was a religious community first. And they parceled out parcels of land, and then they were all part of that community. It wasn't a government set up first, it was a religious community.
What did the Native Americans live in? What did their homes look like, and how did they keep?
Wigwams, they had wigwams. Yeah, this is Fort Corchog is like, yeah, wait one second. Yes.
Yeah.
Fort Corchog is one of the landmarks. I just saw it Newsday. I saved the paper. It's a landmark spot, an archaeological dig, but you can't see this in the Indian Museum in South Pole, which is right around the corner from me. I spent a lot of Sundays there. They have examples of wigwams where they lived, and
There was straw or hay or grass?
the tops were, I believe that was cattails. They used grasses. Yes, and they were called the summer wigwam. So I think they used them in the winter too, but I'm not really sure unless you know.
Not located on the shoreline, though. They were moved inland for the winter.
For the winter.
And only use the coastal southern during the summer.
Okay. And I also found out that they call it Fort Corchog, but it wasn't the kind of fort that we think of. It's really a settlement. And there was an area where they were protected, a stockade where they were protected, but they only went there when they were being invaded. And it was usually the Pequots, not the white settlers who were invading the area or warring with them.
So was other Native Americans trying to move in on the land that other Native Americans had?
Well, there was a lot of
Not so much the land as to the Shinnecock nation, if you will, and their ancestors were forced to pay tribute in Wampum to the Narragansetts and the Pequots from over Connecticut, which were a fiercer, more warring tribe. They had interaction with the Mohawks, I believe, and a lot of the other warring tribes of coastal New England. So they were a threat, and by canoe across the Sound, they would come and demand payment in Wampum to keep the peace. And the stockades were built as a retreat for the negotiations to work, I guess. But it wasn't so much for the land, it was for the shells that were so valuable to them.
Shells.
well, that's what I want to explain about
Yeah,
Wampum.
this is her fault.
Huh?
This is your
Yeah, listen, jump in. I did a lot of research, and it was 2 years ago, and I don't remember all of it. But I remember the important parts, but not all of it. The other thing that I found fascinating was Fort Corchog was a wampum-producing settlement. And when I was a kid, when I learned what wampum was, I learned that it looks like jewelry. I thought I'd heard that it was used as money. Well, when I went to the South Hold Indian Museum, okay, there's some pictures of it. Of course, they're black and white if you just want to see. Wampum, first of all, it was a wampum-producing settlement. That's what the people there did. Besides, of course, provide enough food for them to eat. But wampum is made from whelk shells. I want to show you. And these are, they make, usually if they're cut and they're polished, and they use either cedar bark to strain through it, or rawhide, then rawhide. And this is the common color, and they're usually the white shells, but this is much more desirable, and it was more sought after, the blue. Yeah, I just wanted to show, because my son-in-law keeps telling me that this is a conch shell. It's not. But anyway, so that's, but when they were produced, wampum was used in the Native American culture as, it was given as gifts during important ceremonies or important times in people's lives. And so the Native Americans looked at wampum one way. It was also given, if there was a death in the family, it was given. They made, they wove with leather, they wove stories about different times in their lives, in the tribe's lives. I hate to say tribe, the clan's lives. In other words, if there was a fight with the Pequots, they would show that with wampum. It would be woven into a story like leather. It looked artsy, but that would tell a story. But when the Dutch came in, who came in before the English, and they saw this, they wanted to use it as money because they didn't have enough coins, that kinds of things. So they wanted to use it. They would use it as barter or as money, and they would, because that's another thing, I couldn't find out what each shell was worth. You know, that to me was important, and they would assign a different amount to the wampum.
So what you're saying is before the Dutch came in, they were using the wampum, they had some hieroglyphics or something, it was like for telling a story. But then after it was put together in that form, instead of on a rock or something, it was put together, strung together, a story.
Yeah, that's one use.
Yeah, that was one use,
Right.
and then later, and then when they started trading it,
The trade could be a necklace or bracelet. The trading could be.
but that wasn't, they weren't trading the ones that they used for stories, were they?
I don't believe so. I'm not sure about that, but I know that it was used by the Dutch as a medium of exchange. That's why I wanted the title to be the Wampum Exchange, because it was used as an exchange.
Right.
Yes.
I'm reading the book, Island in the Center of the World, by Russell Sherrill. And he mentions that the agreement with the Dutch and the Indians on the Hudson was that a beaver pelt was worth 4 hands length of wampum. And one of the big problems was that in New Amsterdam, there were many, many, many different kinds of currency floating around because there were many, many different kinds of people coming through. But the wampum was kind of the standard of measure. And they had to make a distinction between the good blue wampum that you're mentioning here and the kind of really bad stuff that came out to the market. And so there were various levels of exchange of that.
Oh, yeah.
But a beaver pelt, of course, that was the name of the game, and that was 4 hands worth of wampum. My question is, I'm not too sure what the wampum really looked like. I hear it talk about it as being beads or shells or.
It's hard to see in here. I went back to the Indian Museum several times because I wanted to see. I wanted to keep looking at it, and it's really different. Some of it looks like beads. Some of it are shells like close together,
Okay.
so that it looks.
But these are actually
Here,
kind of a bead with a hole in it?
there, they do.
Some was,
Some.
and in some cases, the raw material
Oh, I
itself
see.
was also traded
Yeah.
in bulk, but for a lesser value, of course, with the bushel, they actually traded in bushel baskets of some of this medium, in bead and in shell and in broken shell and in intact shell.
Right.
For various purposes, and then which I think Rosemary will probably speak later of, the wampum factories that eventually arose, where it was mass produced. But my understanding, my studies indicate that first it was a storytelling medium. They would weave belts.
Yeah, right.
And it would tell a story, and these belts would be passed down from generation to generation, and were also used as gifts. And then what happened is when the Dutch became involved in the fur trade, they found out that the inland natives, especially further up the Hudson we went, valued the shells more and more because they were further from the source. So they found out that it was very valuable to them, and that's how it became a monetary exchange.
Yeah.
The coins, the Dutch guilders and the other coins that were available were not nearly as valuable to the inland natives as were the shell beads.
Sure.
And the finer the polish and the finer the detail of the bead, the more valuable, and the purple being more valuable than any because its range, the Quahog, which this is a local heart clan, mercenary, I believe is the Latin name, but its range doesn't extend too far south, where white shell, the whelk, the channel whelk, and other whelk species extend up and down the coast all the way down to Florida and I guess South America as well. So the purple shell became more and more valuable to the inland natives because it wasn't as readily available. And they sought it out, and both of these species are tremendously abundant between the forks of the island, which made this a hotspot for production by the natives. And that's why the local natives became subservient to the warring tribes of the north because the raw material was here for making it.
That's why I thought, wampum was an important topic.
Wouldn't that have made these tribes, the Long Island tribes, wouldn't it have made them very wealthy tribes?
They did okay.
Or not?
Well, when you talk about,
Wealth was not really
they didn't look at wealth the way the Europeans looked at wealth. But the other thing I learned when I started doing the research for this book, this area was just teeming with shellfish and game. It was just teeming with it. So to a person who lives off the land, that's wealth right there. There's, for the Europeans, there was so much timber, so they could build their homes. I mean, it was just, in fact, when the people came into Southold, and I'm not sure about Southampton, but because those were the first groups, they couldn't believe how much more the food that was available here compared to New England. It was just amazing. So that's another reason why when they came here, more and more people started to come because it was so abundant, the food. So when you talk about wealth, it's not the same kind of a concept.
What was the date, if they know precisely, of the settlement at Southold?
1640.
1640, and what before that? Simply a couple of explorers went through and saw it, or
The first settlement.
first settlement?
Yeah, I can't be sure that.
Somewhere in the last 20 years, someone wandered through and saw it.
Yeah, I
then,
can't.
But
The first settlement, English settlement. The Dutch were here before.
they had settlements there.
I'm not really sure if they had settlements
where
in Southold.
natives or
No, Dutch. I'm sorry.
not to
Not a settlement.
not to anyone's knowledge, but you would think that because I've researched the same that they most likely had explored. The Dutch in New Amsterdam were not at all interested in settling even New Amsterdam. It was purely a location to trade from, to bring furs to Europe. And they were not interested in expanding their settlement. They were interested in controlling the fur trade. The English, on the other hand, were looking for permanent settlement. So they had different interests. The Dutch likely visited eastern Long Island either by boat or because their maps indicate some detail of the coastline, which means they had to have been here to draw that detail. But an actual Dutch settlement, there's no evidence of one.
No.
much east of the Nassau-Suffolk line. The Nassau-Suffolk line was the line that demarked the English territory and the Dutch territory.
Yeah.
But then one other thing that I did come across when I was doing the research, the Dutch were definitely here, but they didn't speak about a settlement, because the design of the Fort Korchog, they believe, because it's the only existing settlement or fort, Indian settlement, the design of it's more like the Dutch design, and I'm not sure whether it was round or rectangular, but it showed that, so they think that the Dutch influenced the building of it, but there, to answer you, yeah, there was no settlement.
Which may well have been that the natives from Korchog in trade taking their furs because there was a place to exchange. It seems like it is a long way, but the natives were used to traveling long distances for even tribal, if you will, gatherings, that they may well have visited New Amsterdam and seen the stockades that they had built in New Amsterdam, and then brought that technology with them out this way, rather than vice versa.
The Dutch span of, I guess, claim to land was a distance from what they call the Fresh River, which is the Connecticut River now, down to the Chesapeake, and what they call the South River, and of course the North River was the Hudson. And they came in 1624, and they picked up on Henry Hudson's claim to that area in 1609.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big problems that Peter Stuyvesant had was that the people that you're talking about that came down from Massachusetts Bay and
New Haven.
Well, yeah, but they came down into New Haven and to Hartford, and it made Peter Stuyvesant quite nervous, because that was the extent of his domain. And he actually had a fort there staffed by maybe a half a dozen or a dozen soldiers, but so many people from New England were coming down because they got upset about the strenuousness of the religious rules and so on. They left Massachusetts Bay and came down to a freer area. Then in 1650, Stuyvesant had a meeting with John Endicott, and they settled, and they just took a map and drew a north-south line and said things east of that were English and things west of that were Dutch. And of course, that's the line that is the Nassau County line now, which you mentioned. The Nassau County line, I think, is about 10 miles off of that original mark. But I think they just took a ruler and said, that's it. And it settled the issue. And so New Haven and Hartford were English, and of course they came to this part of the world. Right. And the Dutch had, of course everybody knew about it, because the whole area was mapped. But the Dutch were more interested in trading, and they had their trade routes through the Caribbean and Brazil and so on. It was really a pivot for them.
Like you say, it's a different approach to the new world, what they wanted from it.
I think also, if I recall, the part of the motivation for the settlements on Long Island, the English settlements at Southwold and Southampton, were to stem the encroachment, if you will, of the Dutch into. They didn't want them to control all. Wampum had become so valuable, and the fur trade had become so valuable, that the New England colonies were concerned that the Dutch were going to control it all if they did not get a foothold somewhere on Long Island, and they pushed into the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They pushed into Connecticut colony, and they went as far as the river before they met resistance from the Dutch. And Hartford, of course, being a very central trading settlement for fur trade, they just wanted to get a foothold in on this wampum trade. And I've had discussions with Zach Studenroth, the historian in Southampton, who's the director of the Whaling Museum, as to the fact that it may have been the real reason why, and not so much religion, that they came to Long Island, to eastern Long Island in particular.
Another take on it. But I did read that they could not believe the abundance of everything here as compared to where they were. And naturally, that's a good
Wait,
thing.
I'm just curious, well, I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, so right near there was north of Hartford, and there's maybe it's worse than north of Hartford, the Phillips Stockade. Do you know what that was?
No, I've heard of it, and I believe it
I never quite knew.
is a good possibility that that was one of the fur trading outposts. I'm familiar with the name, so I'm thinking that in my research of that, I didn't really look into that area for any reason. That it
And
was,
it's on the river, it's on the Connecticut.
it was probably relative to the fur trade.
When you're talking about the wampum, okay, the Indians, you know, were interesting. Was there any kind of development? Was it something that they just went, you know, the individual went and got it? And was there a central point what was traded? Was there, how did they extract it? Was individual, or was there, you know, not a factory, but
Well, they actually called it a factory after a while because it was in such demand. And they said, I'm trying to think of the whole, I can't remember now, the whole point of the fact that they said it was a blessing and it was a curse to be a wampum producing area, because then you could be invaded by another tribe because they wanted more of it or whatever. So, but Fort Quarchog was a wampum producing settlement. It wasn't, you know, when I heard fort the first time, I thought it was, oh, well, you know, people protected each other there. That wasn't the point of it. It was a settlement to produce wampum. And there's an abundance of shells.
yeah.
You know, where I live, that's why these are just all over the place. And I mean, I know it's 400 years later, but all over. And this type of clam also, the shell is all over.
But they were like people collecting them and bringing them to.
Yes, they collected them, and a lot of the women were doing the polishing, the cutting. They cleaned them first. As far as that's the research that I found. They had a whole area where they were working on that because they divided up labor. You know, some people were foraging. Some people were, you know, collecting. A lot of the children were collecting the clams for dinner. That was one part of it. They collected acorns and they made a flour out of that. All kinds of different. And other men went out and hunted and brought back, you know, large game. So they divided up their labor. And some people they produced wampum. That was their job.
I've managed to put together a pretty sizable collection of native artifacts. I have a lot of arrow points and tools that they use
Yes.
that I collected near my home when I was living in Flanders. And the picture that I've gotten from the sites that I would find artifacts is that these summer camps near the shore, likely, you know, they were fishing, they were gathering clams, they were gathering shells, they were smoking foods for the winter to take back to these winter grounds, which are a little further inland and protected from the winds and the high tides from winter. Probably, I mean, envision it, if you were going to work on making fine jewelry or whatever, you would first gather the raw material, and I can't really see them bringing, maybe they would, bushels of the intact shell, but the children and the women would probably be on the shoreline with the men who may be out in canoes fishing, or maybe they were on the shoreline hunting. I'm trying to get a picture of what was going on, and then break the usable portion of the clam for the wampum is only really that outer rim. Getting real good at figuring out how to strike this thing and filling satchels with the raw materials to take back, and in the cold months of winter when there was nothing else to do, it would sit in these wigwams that they would polish and make these beads and bangles and things, but gather the raw materials when they were down on the shoreline working, and then probably make and polish these things inland. Because I found a lot of the abrader stones, they abraded a lot of things, I can't really tell what they were, they definitely were abrading stones, but I found a lot of them inland. So they were carrying these tools inland, and it was their habit as well to drop their tools where they worked, and not move them from one site to another. So they would have a catch of tools, hidden up on a big rock in the woods, and when they came back next winter, the tools would likely still be there. And I found catches of these tools. So
They wouldn't keep the tools on themselves.
not necessarily. Some they might, maybe for napping an arrowhead, if they broke one and they wanted to reshape it, they might have a little pouch with the napping tools that they needed. But especially larger hammer stones and things, that they wouldn't carry them around with them, they were too bulky. So they would catch them in their winter settlements and use them over the winter. So I think that, and it makes sense to me. Can I document that? No, but that's kind of a picture that I have in my head of what was going on, and it makes sense.
But did the Indians show them how to do it, or did it just, the settlers just decided that's how it would be done?
No, this was a native trade.
Wasn't it?
It was the natives who showed the colonists,
Yeah.
and then in later years, the colonists actually, when they discovered the value of wampum and incorporated it into their monetary system,
Yeah.
they actually set up, John Jacob Astor was involved with one, I think it was the Campbell Wampum Factory in New Jersey, where they would take boatloads of shell, and the European settlers came up with a mass production system of making the beads, because it's very labor intensive.
Yeah.
I've tried making it myself, and it's
It
with
looks labor
stone
intensive.
drills and sandstone abraders. Making those tiny little beads is very labor intensive.
It
And
looks,
they would make bushel baskets full of these beads, reported. I mean, so that was like a whole family for months on end, just polishing these little stones, and incredible amount of work.
yes.
How did the natives barter and trade with the new settlers? Was it a wampum, or was it a barter? I'll give you a blanket I've woven if you give me some of your cord. I mean, what went on there?
Well, I mean, from what I could gather, they didn't have a whole lot of interaction in the beginning. And then as things changed, they did barter, but the Native Americans gave them the corn seeds, showed them how, in the beginning, they just gave it to them and showed them how to grow the way they grew, the squash and the beans. And as far as bartering, I can't really answer that from anything I've read, but I would think that if they could they would barter with each other. If the settlers needed something, but I mean, Native Americans produced what they needed. I couldn't see them bartering unless it was later on. Not in 16.
Well, you said at first they got along. Then what
Yes.
happened?
From what I've read, the first settlements, they wanted more and more land. And they, like I said, when you sit down with somebody who has a totally different idea of land, and you're trying to buy land that from what I read, the first time this happened, the Native Americans believed that the land was for everybody, and you're just gonna be there, and then you're gonna leave, because they were nomadic, and if they were if they were finished in an area, they left. But I think the problem that occurred was that when the local settlers wanted more and more land, and then they kept pushing them out. And they did have, I found all the, if you want to call them contracts with the signatures, I did see all of that. So I think that's when the problem came in. And that was later.
Well, who was signing what? Were the British signing something?
They actually would
Settlers?
meet and the head of the tribe, the head of the clan
Mhm.
would sign. 'Cause that's how I found some of the names to.
How did they write? What did they write?
I actually saw, some of it's an X and some of it is actually their writing. It's close to, the letters wouldn't be the same because they speak, their language is all spoken, so it looks pretty, it looks like you could tell, like Ambusco is the boy that I have in the book, and there's an A there. And some Native Americans did learn some English, and they did learn how to write some.
Access were pretty common, just witnessed by Europeans. you know.
Yes. Because the witnesses, the names are
It's like
there.
having your lawyer tell you to sign here without reading the document.
So, but
He signs.
yeah, it deteriorated when the English settlers wanted more and more land, and they were pushing them out. In fact, the Fort Chalk people ended up, this is what I read, in Southold somewhere. So from Cutchogue to Southold, and then they kept being pushed out. But they did say, oh, well, you can move over here, and I don't think that was what they had, the Native Americans had in mind.
I didn't think it blew up in a really big way, like a whole regional way until
No.
King Philip's War and,
Yeah, it was,
what, 30 years later?
Here.
it was, yeah, it took time.
Yeah, but
Because,
then it spread over that whole northeast.
yeah, because in 1640, when they first came, and in 1650, they were, how do you put it, separated basically, and they left each other alone. There was plenty for everybody. So it didn't come to that.
Yeah.
But when like I read Heaven and Earth by Steve Wick and William Wells, he was one of the people who kept wanting more and more land, and he wasn't supposed to be so nice about it. I don't know, I don't remember the whole story, but he wanted to obtain more and more land, and he did.
The natives didn't understand the concept of land ownership. It was,
They really didn't.
they were territorial. They controlled, well, not controlled, but they came and went on certain lands that they considered as theirs, their lands. Not, but they didn't actually own the real estate. I think the problem began to rise when the English would put up permanent settlements, like at Old Town and something to over Founders Land and the Southwold community, which interrupted their normal migrations, their hunting ground. They didn't expect them to stay. They were kind of, I think what they believed they were signing was an agreement to let the white man share the land with them, but not to set up a permanent village, and now they can't come there to hunt the next season. They didn't really know what they had gotten themselves into. And then as the white colony grew and encroached on more and more of their hunting ground and their ancestral ground, and especially when they started interfering with their burial grounds, that's when that started.
That was the last straw.
One of the issues in so-called buying land, if you want to call it that, of course, the Indians didn't have the concept of ownership of the land because the land was for everybody. But the Indians did have a lot of good and bad relationships with other tribes.
Yes.
And when you made a so-called donation for the land, this is what the Indians considered, you were actually buying into the idea that you would support them in their local wars. And the Indians would get very upset when the settlers would take the land and then not support them with the Mohawks and the Iroquois and all their feuding back and forth. And so then the Indians got upset at the settlers, and they would attack the settlers would start attacking the Indians. But there was that concept that when you gave a donation or bought, took the land or had the right to use the land, you could use the land, but you were also buying into supporting them militarily in their various wars. And when that broke down, then there was a lot of trouble back and forth.
I think there were a lot of factors involved in that. Yes, that was another.
Someone had asked earlier about what they traded and meant to, excuse me. One item which is interesting that they valued highly compared to all the other things you think they might have valued were tiny steel muxers, they were called, they were drills. And they were used for making the wampum because, as I said, it was so labor intensive to make that bead with stone drills and stone tools that a steel tool that could drill through the shell was highly prized. And that was one of the first trade items that were exchanged between the natives and the colonists, which tools that they could use to make things, make it easier for them, especially to make wampum.
That makes a lot of sense, because of, well, like you said, the labor-intensive nature of producing the wampum.
How did they store food to eat in the winter? When they harvest and then,
Well, the winter was the easy time, because if it's cold enough, you know, they smoked some of the meat, they kept meat on poles to dry, and then, as you said, if you're taking them inland and it's cold, as far as I know, that could be, you could keep them in the like a storage wigwam where it was cold. I mean, that to me would make sense. I know about the ice houses for the settlers. I was fascinated to find that out, but sometimes, well, they would actually take ice from the fresh water, not the salt water, and pack it, and the ice houses were usually round, and they would pack that, and they could keep, now of course this is a little bit later too, but they could pack meat in there, you know, whatever you wanted to keep cold so it wouldn't deteriorate. And as far as this is the research, it said that some of those ice houses, I guess because they were so packed so tightly, sometimes the ice lasted at least a year. I'm sure not the whole thing, but
Oh, they would dig,
okay.
like, take something size half this room and dig down, and then pack the ice, and then we'd have a roof on it. Or just a clay roof. And then they go down into it. So the ice could stay all year, even in the summertime, for instance.
Yeah, that's what they
They
said.
insulated the layers with salt, which was a huge
Yes,
commodity back in the day as well.
that preserved, that was the only thing they had to preserve besides the cold, ice, and the salt.
okay, now, here's a dumb question.
There are no dumb questions.
Only dumb answers. I'm fascinated by the concept of, then they brought their cows and their roosters. How many cows do you start out with, and where do they come to get one cow here? I mean, did
It's
they bring them
amazing.
over
I
from England?
believe
Did they start out with 100 and
They
then
brought them to New England, as far as I know. I could be wrong. And then when they came here, they brought whatever they had with them. But
what animals did they find here?
Oh,
Horses?
they didn't, nobody had horses in the beginning. The Native Americans certainly did not.
They had dogs and,
Yeah, their dogs were prized.
but
The
no horses.
horses came, I can't give you a date, but they came later.
The livestock was brought on the boats.
Yeah, that's what I
The
think.
settlers.
The Spanish brought horses to North America very early on, because of California, of course, Mexico. But out east, it wasn't until the British were pretty well established. But
They had oxen.
They brought oxen.
The oxen were the ones who pulled the plows, and that's what they used to get to the meeting house on Sundays to pull their wagons, the oxen. And they had chickens. I know they had them. Of course, they produce plenty of other chickens, so you don't have to.
They brought pigs.
Pigs,
Or
they
that
had
was pretty
pork.
early.
Yes, they had pigs, and and of course, lots of wild game that you would eat, that you would hunt, but, so those are the ones I
Was there,
remember.
were there romances? Was there an intermarriage between the Native Americans and other than Johnson?
Not early on, because they didn't have a lot of contact with them. I mean, that'd be hard to marry somebody that you not really see. They didn't really have much contact in the beginning. I'm talking about because I studied 1640 to 1650. Later on, I would think yes, but I can't give you a date. But I would think that happened later.
The sequel.
Sequel, I like this. This is my sister. She's got great ideas. Not early on. In fact, the two boys in the story, they meet up with each other. They don't really even see each other because their paths don't cross. And it was a chance meeting, and so I think that it did happen, but it was not in 1650. But I'm sure it did happen later on.
I lost track. The people coming over from New Haven to Southold,
Yes,
they first arrived when? Around
1640.
1640.
1640. I can't give you the month.
No,
I don't remember the month, but it's Southampton. It was only like 2 months later.
yeah, right,
Because they fought over who was first.
yeah.
And I read so much about it. It was only a matter of months.
Well, Southampton has that sign, oldest English settlement in New York,
I know.
but I think it's later than 1650, and there were
40.
but there were 5 families that came over from Lynn, Massachusetts, that landed at Conscience Point, and there's a plaque there. And I think they're familiar names like Howells and the Halseys,
Yeah. Well,
the Sayers.
I have read so much, and it's so controversial. And of course, the people in Southampton, they say they were first. And people in Southold said they're first. But from what I read from New York State, it's Southold, but it's only a couple of months. It's not so to me, they're both the first, I don't know. Yes.
Tell them they're both second.
Okay.
When they first came over, were they sponsored by some group, or did they come over individually? Did they just kind of drift over?
They were granted patents for 8 square miles of land
From Sterling.
from the Earl of Stone.
Right, okay.
And James Farrett was an agent for the Earl of Stone, who had surveyed, had looked at this. He had sailed, following the skirmish there at Saybrook that Wine Gardner was involved with in 1637, I believe, when he defeated the Pequots. And he was granted for his service there Gardner's Island,
Right.
which was actually the first English settlement in the state of what would become New York. And the sachem of the Shinnecock Nation, but the Montauk tribe, if you will, Wyandanch, befriended Gardner because he was involved because of this fierce battle with the Pequots, who they feared. They had been paying tribute to the Pequots for generations. So that got Gardner in here about 1638 or 9. But Farrett, who was the first real estate agent on the land, sailed around the Upper Bay up into the Flanders section where my home was, and where I'm very familiar. And I'm guessing that based on native settlements, now they're moving to a brand new land, they're trying to establish a foothold in the wampum trade, but they really don't know how fierce these tribes, it's got to be a little bit of some fear involved there. So we're going to just set up camp. I'm thinking that as Farrett made it up bay in between the forks and began to see the permanent settlements, or not permanent settlements, but probably the summer settlements of the South Fork natives and the North Fork natives, which were concentrated up near the Mekong River. They said, okay, that's not far enough, and they backed off a little bit, and it's kind of ironic that Southold's at Conscience Point is nearly opposite Southold's as well. In other words, let's not go way upriver, it looks like there's a lot of native activity, let's back off a little. And the New Haven colonists selected the North Fork and South Fork side,